I'm supposed to talk about the writing life, but for many years I wasn't a writer. I was a freelance scientist. The only author I knew lived at the hotel where I grew up. This hotel was on the Mexican border, and the rooms cost $3 with air conditioning and $2 without. It had been built in 1870, and the outer walls were 6 feet thick to keep out the 120-degree heat we had every summer. Through the years, these walls had cracked, and all kinds of insects had moved in. From there, they were within striking distance of anything yummy in our kitchen. I remember opening the bread box and finding an entire ant colony with the queen living in a muffin. For my 9th birthday, my mother baked a chocolate cake. This was a special treat, and particularly so because she had covered it with cinnamon sugar. At least, that's what I thought she had done. When I got close, I saw that the chocolate icing was seething with little red ants. But we weren't rich, so my mother peeled off the icing and we ate the cake anyway. Ants, by the way, taste sour. They are streets ahead of cockroaches as far as flavor goes. During the rainy season, the Colorado River rose. Thousands of crickets left the riverbed and fled into the town. The streets were black with them. Cars slid all over the place when people tried to drive. The crickets ate laundry off the clothesline, preferring nylon and rayon, but they would accept cotton if nothing better was available. They covered the screen on my bedroom window, and because the screen wasn't tight, a lot of them squeezed inside. I could hear them chirping all night. Crickets have 3 kinds of chirp. One is the sound all of us associate with summer nights. It means, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. Another chirp is sudden and loud. It means, get out of my way or I'll kill you. Crickets are vicious fighters and the losers get eaten. The third chirp is low and intimate, and it means, hey baby, hey baby. The town got rid of them by spraying DDT. One of my earliest memories is of chasing the DDT truck and getting covered with insecticide. I looked like I'd been dipped in flour, which I thought was pretty neat. When I was young, I didn't have dolls. This was simply because it didn't occur to my parents that I needed them, so I played with crickets. Later, during the yearly stink bug infestation, I played with stink bugs. And during the woolly worm plague, I played with woolly worms. Thus, it was inevitable I would become an entomologist. However, if my parents didn't notice the lack of dolls, the owner of the liquor store did. He gave me his old displays. I remember making up long stories using the characters of Johnny Walker, Old Crow, and the 2 Scotty dogs from the black and white whiskey ad. About the author who lived in the hotel. His name was Hasselbaum, and he wrote westerns. He wrote 1 a month. They were pretty much alike, with the hero who was tall and blonde with ice blue eyes. At some point, near the end of the book, the hero would say, "Look into my ice blue eyes," which meant he was about to break up the furniture and beat the snot out of the villains. At age 9, I was given the job of keeping the hotel desk during the afternoons. I rented rooms, folded sheets from the laundry, and ran the switchboard. One of my tasks was to make sure Hasselbaum got enough to eat. He earned $300 every month from his books. With this, he could pay for his room and keep up a steady supply of whiskey. My job was to provide him with enough egg sandwiches to dilute the whiskey. I got them from a restaurant on the corner, took them up to Hasselbaum's room, and curled his fingers around them. One day, I went up to find Hasselbaum on the floor. He was sweating heavily and twitching. He didn't answer when I called him. I was about 10 years old at the time. My parents were out of the hotel. I have to say here that I was a very shy and not very confident child, but a sense of responsibility had been drilled into me. I called an ambulance. At age 10, I had seen quite a few drunks, but I had never seen a case of delirium tremens. The ambulance men arrived and went upstairs. When Hasselbaum saw them, he picked himself off the floor. He was over 6 feet tall and built like a wrestler, and said, "Look into my ice blue eyes." Whereupon, he broke up the furniture and beat the snot out of the paramedics. This, then, was my experience with writers. I'm going to skip quite a few years now. I became a freelance scientist. Translated, that means someone who doesn't have a good education, but who is willing to work at jobs no one else would consider. Thus, I worked for Cutter Labs in Berkeley making bubonic plague vaccine. I had a short-term job on an oceanographic boat for a man nicknamed Captain Crunch. His previous experience had been running tugboats in Vietnam. Since tugboats are surrounded by rubber tires, they don't have to be careful about running into things, and Captain Crunch didn't worry about running the oceanographic vessel into things either. He used to stand at the helm stark naked with a bottle of rum by his side, while the rest of us ran around trying to keep the microscopes from falling off the shelves. The job ended when the captain tore a 20-foot hole in the side of the boat. I worked for the California Highway Department controlling insects that ate traffic islands. This is a bigger problem than you might think, because insects eat their way along from the deserts, following the landscapings on freeways, and they work their way from one area to another, such as the vineyards of Northern California. Now, at some point, I read Jane Goodall's books on Africa. She is a role model for freelance scientists because she too had little education when she began studying chimpanzees. It seemed to me that all you needed was a ticket to Africa, some bananas, and a bunch of chimpanzees. I talked it over with my best friend Dolores, and we decided to go. Unfortunately, we had no money. Dolores reasoned that we would need a large boat to cross the Pacific Ocean. The docks at Berkeley and Fisherman's Wharf were too shallow for the kind of yacht she had in mind, so we went to Sausalito. Every weekend, we walked up and down the docks of Sausalito calling, "We want to go to Africa. Who will take us?" And one day, we got an answer. "I'm going to Africa, and I'll take you." The ship was absolutely spectacular. It was an old Norwegian Coast Guard vessel built in 1870. It was made of teak and had a hull shaped like a wine glass. The windows in the galley were prisms, so the inside was full of rainbows. The captain said he needed a crew. If we would give him all our money and promise to work for nothing, he would take us to Africa. I'm sure most of you can see the flaws in that plan. But Dolores and I were too starry-eyed to care. We quit our jobs, packed our bags, and drew all our money out of the bank. Our friends gave us goodbye parties. Now, Dolores had a boyfriend in the Coast Guard, and he did some checking. He discovered that the captain didn't own the boat, he was planning to steal it. The man wasn't even a real captain. He was a caretaker. And as a caretaker, he had the right to sail the boat in the bay, but he didn't have the right to take it beyond the Golden Gate. Dolores' boyfriend didn't tell us this because he didn't trust us. He let us sail off through the Golden Gate and into the arms of the Coast Guard. They dumped us back on shore, told us to go home and not to be such ninnies next time. Thus ended my first attempt to get to Africa and become the next Jane Goodall. Dolores got married, I got a job with the entomology department at Berkeley, and several years passed. And then I decided to go to Africa again. But this time I was more careful. I bought a real ticket on a freighter. I had $500 in traveler's checks, and I had a list of African scientists. My plan was to walk to the nearest scientist and ask for a job. I would start at the bottom of Africa and work my way up, coming out around Egypt or Morocco. I was hired as part of a team to work on Lake Cabora Bassa in Mozambique. We were supposed to do plant and animal surveys, train villagers how to fish, check drinking water purity, and keep weeds from fouling up the intake valves of Cabora Bassa Dam, which was a giant hydroelectric dam. My first job was to pick up a company car in Johannesburg. The car was brand new, and at the last minute, the company attached a trailer full of equipment to it. I have never been a good driver. I only understood automatic, and this car had a stick shift. I had never pulled a trailer. The company said they didn't have a map, but all I had to do was drive north till I got to Rhodesia and turn right. Sooner or later, I would get to Mozambique, and I mustn't take a dirt road because they were full of landmines. And oh yes, the company had neglected to get an import permit for Mozambique, so when I got there, I was to drive into the bushes and smuggle the equipment in. The first day out, I ran into a cloudburst, and the windshield wipers broke off. I went off the road and into a swamp. When I backed up, the trailer jackknifed and stove in the side of the car. I had only got 20 miles. By nightfall the next day, I had made it all the way to Rhodesia. South Africa was a modern country with a lot of street lights. Rhodesia was the darkest, emptiest place I had ever seen. The road went on and on. It got later and later. I looked for a town, but there was nothing except forest and occasional eyes shining in the headlights. Suddenly, far ahead, I saw white shapes moving in the air. As I got closer, the shapes resolved themselves into gloves. It was a police roadblock. The policemen were black and they wore black uniforms, and the only thing you could see was their white gloves waving in the air. They searched the trailer for weapons and then directed me to a hotel down a side road. I learned then that the air over Rhodesia was so clean you couldn't see a town at night until you were actually in it. There wasn't enough pollution to create a glow in the sky. The next day, the police told me where to find a paved road, but the tar only lasted a few miles. I pulled over to consider the problem of landmines. After a while, a bus came by. I followed it, reasoning that it would blow up before I did, sort of an impromptu minesweeper. I didn't know then that the terrorists packed mines in cooked cornmeal. This kept the trigger from depressing until several vehicles had gone over. I was to have several vacationing terrorists working for me in Mozambique, and during tea breaks they taught me some of their techniques. I smuggled the trailer across the border and set off for Songo, the town at the dam wall of Lake Caborabassa. Caborabassa had been the gem of the Portuguese Empire, and now it was the gem of Frelimo, the new communist government of Mozambique. It was the most closely guarded place in Africa, and the hill around it was riddled with landmines. You stayed on the road or you got blown up. On the way in was a machine gun nest to make sure you signed the guest book. The only other way out was by the lake above the dam wall, and the survey team I was about to join had the only boats. We were 7 scientists, and eventually we hired 40 boatmen, carpenters, secretaries, and cooks. My first trip on the lake was on a peeling orange slab of metal called the Olifante. It belched black smoke over you the whole time it was running. The dam had recently closed and the lake was still rising, so the animals had fled to the hills, which now became islands, and so they were all concentrated on the islands. Antelopes, elephants, baboons, leopards, and warthogs jostled for position. The trees were dripping with snakes, vipers, mambas, boomslangs, and cobras. We had originally planned to camp on an island, but nobody wanted to tie up to a tree full of cobras. During the next few weeks, almost all the animals swam to shore. The snakes went first. Even the elephants drifted down the lake with their trunks above the water. Only the baboons were too frightened to swim, and so a lot of them starved. When we weren't surveying, we stayed in Songo at the dam wall. I set up a chemistry lab to test water samples. Songo was a sleepy little town. The houses were either of adobe with corrugated iron roofs, or they were the traditional African huts with grass roofs. Everyone had a few desiccated rows of corn and some withered pumpkins. The Portuguese had planted ornamental vines that hung over the fences like giant spider webs. There were 2 outdoor movie screens. One for the scientists showed Ingmar Bergman movies. The other for the laborers had endless kung fu movies. You could have called them drive-ins, except that no one had a car. Needless to say, we had lots of electricity to run movie theaters. We had the biggest powerhouse in Africa. Every month I flew over the lake and photographed its changes. Twice a month I sailed about checking water quality and looking for weeds, along with one of the other scientists, a cook, and a boatman. We camped on islands because they were less likely to have dangerous animals. One of the biggest hazards was hippos. They would spend most of the time in the water, snorting and talking amongst themselves. As long as they made noise, you were safe, but the minute they stopped talking, you knew they had come ashore and were tiptoeing through the bush, possibly toward your sleeping bag. Huge animals are amazingly hard to see in the bush. They look like giant boulders until you are next to them. Once I was ambling happily through the forest when I heard the sound of a bubbling tea kettle. It turned out to be the stomach of an elephant digesting grass. Actually, there were about 10 elephants, but I didn't stay around long enough to count them. We monitored the few villages along the lake, checking their health and food supply. We brought them goodwill gifts of salt and matches, along with bottles of Borgia brandy, which smelled like burning rubber and was very popular. During the full moon, we attended all-night parties with drums and dancing and storytelling. Now I have to move on because the theme of this talk is the writing life, and so far I haven't done any writing. At a certain point, I moved to Rhodesia, met my future husband, and got married. That sounds pretty fast, and it was fast. Harold and I only knew each other about a week before he proposed and I accepted. It changed my life forever. Now I was supposed to stay home in one place and act respectable. I don't want to give marriage a bad name, but let's say I wasn't prepared for it. Even less was I prepared for motherhood. My sole source of information about motherhood had come from watching cats. I had never even picked up a baby. I wasn't that kind of lady. I had to quit my job. I had to stay home. My whole day was supposed to revolve around my son Daniel and the maintenance of the house. It suddenly became important to be sure the napkin rings matched the napkins. Meals were to be on time, not eaten out of cans under trees. Each morning I was supposed to tell the servants what to do, and then suitably dressed, await visitors. Frankly, there were almost no visitors because I was limited to white Rhodesian women who had the attention span of domestic turkeys and who avoided me like the Antichrist. I felt like I had been demoted from human being to the status of a flatworm in a mud puddle. One afternoon, when Daniel was 4, I sat reading a book by Marjorie Forster. It contained a description of a pond in London. The pond had a light crust of ice, too light to support a person, and a family was walking around the edge. One of them, a small boy very like Daniel, decided to walk across the ice. I looked up. A wonderful, light-hearted feeling passed through me. I can do this, I thought. I sat down at my husband's typewriter, and 4 hours later I had a complete short story. It felt marvelous. I had found a way to run away from home without actually leaving the house. I began disappearing with the typewriter whenever a gap in the daily routine appeared. Soon the manuscripts began to pile up. My only real experience with writers had been Hasselbaum, so I asked one of my husband's friends about writing as a career. "Listen to me," he said. Too late I realized he had just drunk half a bottle of whiskey. "Listen to me," he said, breathing Glenfiddich into my face. "There's only one thing you need to know about writers. They're complete bastards. They'd skin their grandmothers to get an editor's attention. They'd sell their wives into slavery and let their children die of starvation for a book contract." Not long afterwards, I was sunbathing at the public swimming pool. Next to me on the grass was the editor of College Press, a local company that did textbooks, poetry, and novels. His name was Stanley Nyamfukudza, and I asked his advice. "Send something over," he said. So I did, and Stanley bought it. More, I discovered that College Press was as close to paradise as an author gets. It was that rare, almost mythical creature, a seller's market. Not many people wrote books in Central Africa. Part of it was because not many people had typewriters. Those of us who did had a technological advantage. Once Stanley accepted you, he would buy anything you produced. You went to him, Stanley said, "How many words does it have?" You told him, and he would pay you 10 cents a word and grant you 10% royalties without even reading the manuscript. He gave you cash on the barrelhead. It was as easy as picking peaches. The reason Stanley was so understanding was because he was a writer too, although he had had writer's block for 7 years. He understood the people who worked for him. He knew they could be petty and egotistical, but he also knew they were possessed by a writing spirit and were unable to do any other kind of useful work. When Stanley said you were possessed by a spirit, he meant it literally. He also ran interference between the writers and the secret police. The one thing you were never supposed to do in Zimbabwe was make fun of the president. You could get 5 years in jail for it. At the time, the president was called Canaan Banana, and he looked like the king in The Wizard of Id. He gave lectures on the Gospel of St. John with a row of bodyguards with machine guns at the back of the hall to discourage criticism. He was absolutely irresistible. Stanley got a visit from the secret police at 3 a.m. They threatened to beat him up, and he threatened the authors if they didn't shut up. But I could get away with political satire in children's books. Children's writers were beneath the radar screen, and anything they did was considered too trivial to worry about. For those of you who are familiar with African literature, I will mention a few of the college press writers. Charles Mungoshi, Ama-Ata Aidu, Solomon Matswairo, and our wild man, Dumbudzo Marichera. Everybody was afraid of Marichera. He tried to burn down one of the colleges at Oxford when he was there. And at a party given in his honor by the British Embassy, Marichera upended the punch bowl on the ambassador. The children's textbooks at College Press were handled by an editor named Margot. A group of us met at her house. Some of the authors even lived there when they were down on their luck. My job was to write the sparkly bits, and the others had to think up questions about grammar and so forth. I arrived early in the morning because everyone started drinking gin at 10 a.m. I needed to get the stories to them while they could still function. These were the children's writers. The adult authors were a lot less disciplined, and some of them never sobered up. One, who is quite famous, and so I won't mention his name, had to be carried upstairs to his lecture hall by his students. As well as writing articles about open-pit copper mining and the disposal of waterborne sewage for the science textbooks, we produced picture books and novels. These were supposed to lure kids into reading for pleasure. They were printed on whatever paper Stanley could find. Sometimes we had newsprint and sometimes meat wrapping paper from the butchers. Usually we had only one color of ink at a time for the cover. Distribution was difficult. Gasoline was scarce. The tires on the delivery truck were retreaded so many times they exploded on the highway and sent the truck into a ditch. If Stanley wanted new tires, he had to put his name on a list and wait a year. One Christmas, the staff was sent out on bicycles to deliver books to the store. This, then, was how I entered the writing life. We were all amateurs. We were full of confidence. We were blessed with understanding editors. Everyone pitched in like a barn raising in Amish country to create a literature in a country that had almost no written literature. I lost my earlier career, but the new one hasn't been too bad. I guess I was training for it all my life, starting with the stories I made up about Johnny Walker and the Black and White Scotties. All my life I've collected stories like adding to a ball of string, and after a while the ball gets so big the only thing you can do is roll it down a hill and see where it goes. Thank you. Okay. Do you want me to ask for questions? Anybody got any questions about anything? I'm going to change to the long-range glasses so I can see who's out there. Doesn't look like it. Okay, fine. Yes?
The ear, the eye, and the arm. How did you get the idea for that?
That one originally came to me in a dream. I dreamed about 3 men who had just one quality, and at the end of the dream they combined into one complete human being. And when I woke up, I realized that the symbol was already there, but that I had actually heard about these characters. They were, there's 3 priests of the Shona religion, and they're called the ear, the eye, and the mouth. And I must have read about them. They interpret the wishes of the divine to people in general, and they live in a secret shrine in the Matopos Hills in southern Zimbabwe. I'd read about them, and it must have sunk into my subconscious. Occasionally, I do get my stories out of dreams. Anything else? Yes?
Also, the ear, the eye, and the arm, it seems that there was a kind of gender and racial equality, maybe not economics, but that everybody was very aware of everybody else's tribe and where they come from. And I wondered what you were thinking of when you thought of society at that time.
Well, that's a very important feature, is that everyone has to know exactly who is related to who, so they know how to relate to them. So that's one of the first things that happens when people meet, is that they kind of figure out who they're related to. It's like when you go down to the south here, to Georgia or something, the first thing they ask you is your genealogy. And so, you know, it's just a feature of the society.
Did you see that in society, though, where that it didn't matter?
It doesn't matter really, except where marriage is concerned, because you can't marry someone that has your particular bloodlines.
I mean, it didn't matter hierarchy.
No, it doesn't matter. What does matter in the book is the amount of money you have, which is true of Zimbabwe now. It's based on money, not on social standing. So there's very much of a class system there. And it's not all racial. Some of it is just simply financial. Any more questions? Yes? Well, it might. Well, I only told you a little bit of it, and not all of it do I really want known, as long as, you know, I'm writing children's books. Maybe someday. Any more questions? Okay. Wait, there's someone back there. I can't see too well. Oh, there. Well, I went into quite a lot of culture shock when I came back. Actually, a great deal had changed. I left, I was kind of a hippie, and all the hippies were pretty well gone when I came back. Although I did find some up in Arcata. Anyway, yeah, when I came here, I had to learn to write, because I'd been spoiled rotten in Africa, and I could write anything and get it published. And so I was very sloppy. I had to sit down and train myself how to write a story that Americans would like and would buy. The other thing is that you have a different slant. When you're in Africa and you're writing about Africa, everybody knows the customs. You don't really have to discuss it. They all know it. When you come here, you have to explain a whole lot. So in The Ear, the Eye, and the Arm, I explain a great deal about family relationships and about various customs, which I would never have had to do in Africa. And the same, a later book I wrote called A Girl Named Disaster has a great deal of African culture in it. And again, I would have written a different kind of book in Africa. Is that enough? Any other questions? Yes? Well, cloning as a subject has been around a really long time. And it showed up originally in Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. It's been in science fiction for a long time, and I've written several short stories which haven't been published on cloning because I find it fascinating. A long time ago, I wrote sort of the skeleton story for The House of the Scorpion. And I showed it to my husband, who said it wasn't very good. So I put it away. Sorry, Harold, but you know. I put it away, and it wasn't very good. I didn't really know what I was doing then. And then later I realized that it wasn't a short story, it was a whole novel in there. I was fascinated partly with cloning because of the question of, are they human or not? Do they have souls? And my husband teaches a course at Foothill College, and he's brought up the subject of cloning with his students. These are college students, and quite a lot of them say that clones don't have souls and that they're really wicked. There's a real prejudice against them. If we ever did come up with human clones, I think there would be a problem. So that was an interesting topic there. I also did that in a Girl Named Disaster. A lot of the theme of that is what actually makes you human as opposed to animal. Because the main character in there almost becomes an animal at one point, and she has to regain her humanity. Anybody? Can't see too well. Okay, looks like that's it. All right, thank you.